Hey folks, welcome back. Good news! I've run out of jokes to make about me being in a new location. Hey boys and girls, you guys like video games, right? I love video games. For example, Sonic? I mean, I assume you guys like video games, 'cause, otherwise, like, what the f*** are you doing here? I mean, I guess you could be here for, like, creepypasta, I guess. No one else was here for it. I was really proud of that episode, man. But hey, video games is only half the equation to playing video games. You also need a controller, a power source, a TV. Okay, so more than half, I guess. You also need a box to put the video game into, and not just any box, you need a video game console. I've always had a unique interest in video game consoles. I've always found everything about them kind of fascinating. The games on them, the hardware involved, etc. But we all know that none of that shit actually matters. What's really important isn't what's on the inside, it's how something looks aesthetically. So what the hell, let's have a little bit of fun today and look through a bunch of different console designs. Some that I own, a lot that I don't, because and talk about my opinions of their physical design. Starting all the way back in the fucking Stone Age of the first generation of video game consoles, we have the Magnavox Odyssey. Released in 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey was technically the first home video game console ever made. And even then, it was barely a video game console. All it did was display lights on the screen, and it came with a bunch of different overlays that you had to physically stick to your TV to make it seem like you were actually playing a game. But the quality of the games doesn't matter. What we're here to talk about is the console design. And look at this thing. It's pretty cool, honestly. Considering the concept of a home video game console literally did not exist prior to the Odyssey, it has a surprisingly timeless design. The only thing that hasn't really aged all that well aesthetically is the wood paneling along the sides of the console. And honestly, I'm a huge fan of wood paneling, so it gets a thumbs up from me. On the other hand is the controller. This thing really screams first home video game console ever. Much like many electronics from the 70s, the cable is very thick, and even though I've never seen one in real life, I imagine it would be rather difficult to contort these in any direction. The Magnavox Odyssey controller came equipped with two knobs, one that moves the dot on the screen vertically, and the other one that changes the language from English to horizontal. Finally, some representation for horizontal speakers. It's kind of funny to think about, but the closest piece of technology to compare the controller to is an Etch-a-Sketch, what with the horizontal knob and the vertical knob. It's honestly not all that much more technologically advanced than an Etch-a-Sketch either. Overall, I think the Magnavox Odyssey is a pretty neat video game console aesthetically, considering it had literally nothing to go off. They could have made something that looked a lot more stupid. The controller fucking sucks, but hey, I mean, you don't see art critics ripping into cave paintings, right? Moving swiftly on to the second generation of home video game consoles, and now we're talking, baby. Finally, we have more than one console to talk about. I'm not gonna cover all of these because I don't care. Sorry to all you Bally Astrocade fans out there. Let's start out with the Intellivision by Mattel and the ColecoVision by Coleco. These two were basically the only things even close to competition to the Atari 2600, and both featured very different and yet still very late 70s, early 80s designs. The Intellivision has that beautiful wood paneling design with all the weird gold plating. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it's kind of neat. And then on the other hand, you got the ColecoVision with its more futuristic design. It honestly kind of reminds me of an old cassette recorder. One thing that's kind of funny about the ColecoVision that's actually common with a lot of old technology is this part right here. Does this not look like you can open this? Like at first glance, I thought maybe this was like a pop-up compartment where you insert the cartridge, kind of like an old cassette tape recorder, but nope, as far as I can tell, it serves no purpose. It's such a strange trend of old technology to have a part that looks like you can open it, but you can't. Overall, the ColecoVision and the Intellivision both had very different but pretty neat designs in my opinion. On the other hand, the controllers just... what the hell is this? Like, I know we were basically working with no source material, but I cannot comprehend why anyone would think that a video game controller, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, would need an entire number pad and side buttons. At least the ColecoVision has an analog stick, meanwhile the Intellivision has this weird rotating disc thing. Admittedly, I've never seen either of these consoles in my life, but I can't imagine either of them being terribly fun to control. But you know what? Fuck the Intellivision, fuck the ColecoVision. It's time to look at the big boss of the second generation of video game consoles, the Atari 2600. And hey, look! We're talking about a video game console that I actually own this time. The first real big success in home video game consoles, the Atari 2600 was basically responsible for bringing video games into your living room. And you know what? Even now, the Atari 2600 is, in my opinion, one of the best looking video game consoles of all time. It may be goddamn massive, but it's just so cool looking. You got the wood paneling, and these cool lines going across the console, which, yeah, they make it kind of a nightmare to clean, but they look cool, so whatever. This guy had a lot of design revisions, but only two that really look different than the original. First, you got the all-black redesign, which was unofficially dubbed the Darth Vader model, which I assume is some sort of pop culture reference that I don't understand. And the Atari 2600 Junior, which was a lower cost 2600 designed to resemble the Atari 7800. Before we move on to the next generation, we got one more Atari console to look at, the Atari 5200, which should mathematically be twice the console of the 2600. This thing is pretty boring looking. Unfortunately, I don't own one, not due to the price or anything, it's mostly just because it doesn't fit in my house. For some reason, the Atari decided to make a follow-up to the 2600 that wasn't really an improvement, and also they put a fucking numpad on the stupid ass. Next up, you guessed it, we're going to the third generation of consoles, and this is when Japan decided to throw their hat in the ring. From Sega, you got the Japan-exclusive SG-1000 and the Sega Master System, neither of which I own because I'm a fucking idiot, I'm sorry. The only reason I bring up the SG-1000 is because it's so cool looking in my opinion. I don't know what it is, but I've always had a fondness for this thing. I love the light gray mixed with the red and white and blue. Honestly, I can't really describe why, but it reminds me of Space Mountain. You know, the Disney World ride? Yeah, I don't know either. Sega's other contribution to the third generation was the Sega Master System, their first real success in the international video game market. And wow, this thing is fucking cool looking. It's got a complete opposite appeal of the SG-1000, and yet it's also got such a neat design. Like, look at all this stuff. What's the point of this? I thought maybe they lit up or something, but as far as I can tell, they're purely for aesthetic value. Either way, it's very cool. I'm a big fan of the Master System. Next up is the Atari 7800, and who cares? It looks like a redesign of the 5200. Moving on. Finally, after 3 console generations, we get a Nintendo console in the form of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom in Japan. The Famicom is really weird looking, man. The controllers are hardwired into it, and strangely enough, they're actually slightly different. The second player is not granted the ability to pause the game, but they do have a volume slider and a microphone. One of the most notable uses for this is The Legend of Zelda, in which the Pole's voice enemy can only be defeated by speaking into the microphone on the second controller. Overall, I mean, it's weird. It's not a bad design necessarily, but it's definitely Nintendo's first attempt at a video game console. In the Western world, the Famicom had a completely different design and was instead called the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short. I don't know about this one, fellas. I mean, it's certainly a timeless console design, and it is technically superior to the Famicom since it has AV out instead of just RF, but it's so fucking gigantic. Like, look at the size of this, dude. And it has like a door where you slide the game in and push it down. It's so weird. Trust me, it's not a bad console design by any means, and I do think it has a lot of aesthetic appeal. In fact, I would say that I prefer it to the Famicom. But I do think that people give it a lot more credit than it deserves, kind of like the Big Eagle belt. I know we're not talking about wrestling, but I don't know where else to express my opinion on this. That belt sucks. It's ugly, it's too small. The NES had one revision, commonly referred to as the top loader, and this thing is pretty cool looking. Not sure how I feel about the little bump, but overall it's an improvement on both of the previous designs. Unfortunately, I, once again, don't have one of these. But I do have a Retron. After the third generation came, you guessed it, the fourth generation of video game consoles. And now we're playing with superpower, baby. First up, we got the TurboGrafx 16, known outside North America as the PC Engine. The TurboGrafx 16 is interesting because unlike pretty much every video game console ever at the time, instead of using cartridges, it exclusively used cards. The Sega Master System also used cards, and the Famicom of course had the disc system, but both of the consoles primarily used cartridges for the most part. But enough about the games, okay? Let's look at what the games stick into. The TurboGrafx 16 had 2 designs, this little white one in Japan and Europe, and this long black one in North America. I am definitely showing a little bit of bias here, but I have to admit that I prefer the Japanese model. I've always had a strange fondness for white electronics for some reason. Plus it's cool that it's so compact and small. Unless there was some sort of technological explanation for it, I think it's kind of weird that the North American version is so much bigger. Next up is the Neo Geo by SNCC. The Neo Geo is kind of in a category of its own. Rather than trying to compete with the other consoles of the fourth generation, the appeal of the Neo Geo was that it was basically the closest thing you could have to arcade quality games in your home. As a result, it had this arcade style controller with a big round joystick and massive cartridges. But in terms of design, this thing is fucking cool looking. It's so sleek and futuristic. I honestly think it might be the best looking console of the fourth generation. And of course, you can't talk about the Neo Geo without mentioning the Neo Geo CD, which is vastly less cool looking in my opinion. I don't know, the Neo Geo CD looks a lot more like a toy than the original design, and I feel like it kind of defeats the purpose of an arcade emulation if you're just going to switch to a normal looking controller. It's still cool looking for sure, I just kind of like the original better. But now we're getting into the big boys, fellas, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Never before and never since has there been such fierce competition between two video game consoles. Sega and Nintendo were out here acting like they were feuding kingdoms fighting over some sort of land dispute when, like, guys, you're just fighting over which box plays rectangles better. Let's start with the Genesis, and this guy has 3 different versions, but I don't care about this one because it's fucking stupid looking. The Genesis started out like this, and mamma mia, That's a nice video game system. Probably should have held off in the Italian accents for a Nintendo console. Or I could have just not done it at all. But jokes aside, I love the original Genesis model. It's got so much personality. I never realized this, but the design is clearly intended to emulate the Sega Master System, what with the red and the switches and these things. In 1993, Sega released the Genesis Model 2, and it's smaller, and it's a nice console for sure. I definitely prefer the original design of the Genesis, but you can't go wrong with either of these guys. On the other hand, you got the Super Nintendo, which had 3 different versions. The European and Japanese Super Famicom had this cool gray-on-gray design with the 4-color Super Famicom logo. Meanwhile, us fucking idiots in North America got this blocky piece of shit. Yeah, despite the fact that the SNES is one of my favorite video game consoles, I really don't like the design of it, especially considering how nice the Super Famicom is. Like, can someone explain to me why Nintendo decided that Japan and Europe get this cool multicolor design and North America gets purple, 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 and purple? As if it wasn't bad enough, in 1998, Nintendo released a revision of the Super Nintendo, and it's even uglier than the original somehow. I do think it's kind of funny how they got rid of the eject button, though. They knew nobody was using that shit. Overall, I try not to make political statements, but on physical design alone, the Sega Genesis is easily the winner here. After the 4th generation of video game consoles came, well, the 5th generation. And this is where shit starts to get a little weird. You got the 3DO interactive multiplayer, who fucking cares? The Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, and last but definitely least, the Atari Jaguar. See, I simply just don't care about the 3DO. The Jaguar, on the other hand, is so stupid that I can't help but talk about it. For starters, the cartridge slot doesn't have little doors to protect it from dust, so that's awesome. Also, the physical design of the console is just garbage. I don't know what it is exactly, but it just looks bad. Not to mention that with the Atari Jaguar CD add-on, it looks like a toilet. It just straight up looks like a toilet. And if that all wasn't bad enough, look at this controller. What is with the fucking number pad? It's just mind-blowing. Like, this thing came out in 1993 and was made by Atari. You know, the company that made one of the most revolutionary video game consoles of all time. I cannot comprehend how they made so many bad decisions with the Jaguar. The fucking Famicom had dust protection doors. And the fucking number pad, like why? Next up we got the Saturn, Sega's unfortunate follow-up to the Genesis. This fella comes in 3 different colors, and by colors I mean shades. The original Japanese model in gray, the white Model 2 from Japan, and the North American black model. The Saturn's nothing to write home about, it's just a rectangle. Interestingly, it has a cartridge slot on the back, which always made me think that it was backwards compatible with the Genesis, but as it turns out it's just for a RAM expansion pack required for certain games, kinda like the N64 expansion pack. Overall, again, the Saturn is pretty whatever design-wise. I would say that I like the white one best. It's got a little bit more character to it, and I like the multicolored buttons on the controller. Next up is the Nintendo 64, and let me just slip on my eggshell walking shoes. Look, I know it's not exactly a fringe opinion that the Nintendo 64 is kind of flawed. Like, I mean, you know, this thing. To be fair though, I actually do prefer the design of the N64 over the Super Nintendo. It's kind of ugly, but it's got more personality to it. Not too sure about these weird legs or whatever. Honestly, it probably would have looked better without them. To the Nintendo 64's credit, it did have a line of very cool looking translucent colored models, such as this beautiful ice blue one. This entire episode has actually just been an excuse to show off my cool blue Nintendo 64. If you're not swimming in PlayStations, do you even collect video games? That's right, we've finally gotten to it, Sony's competition obliterating PlayStation. And I gotta say, I love this thing. The light gray color, the bubbles, the PlayStation logo, it's so cool, it just screams 90s. Sony also released a redesign in 2000 with a white color and a more rounded design. There is one of these in my house somewhere, but I don't really feel like getting crushed to death under boxes looking for it, so you'll just have to take my word. I definitely feel more of a connection to the original model since I grew up with it, but I gotta say that this is definitely the better looking console. It's smaller, rounded, it's got a nicer color, it's a fantastic design. Thankfully for both of us, we've only got 4 generations to go. With the 6th generation, we got the Nintendo GameCube, the Sega Dreamcast, the Xbox, and the PlayStation 2. And hey, it only took them 4 generations, but Nintendo finally made a home video game console with a design that I like. The GameCube is weird. It's also technically not a cube, but it's still very cool. For starters, it's got a disc cover rather than an optical disc drive, meaning that it doesn't need to be turned on to open, which is always a plus in my opinion. It's also got a handle on the back, so that's pretty cool. Doesn't really contribute anything, but it certainly doesn't hurt, I guess. Mine, of course, has a Game Boy player attached to the bottom, which is why it's taller, although it still isn't a cube. Next up is the Dreamcast. Oh, Ben, there's no way you have a Dreamcast. You only have the consoles everyone has. Oh yeah, is that right? I don't have any games for it. But here we are at Sega's last console, the Dreamcast, and you know what? It was a great console to go out with, all things considered. I mean, it was a massive failure, yes, but it had a lot of really awesome games, and I mean, look at this thing. It's so cool. It's got an Ethernet port. In 1998. Who the fuck was gonna use this, Sega? God bless the one guy browsing Sonic forums on his Dreamcast in 1999. Jokes aside, it was pretty innovative. Even if the Dreamcast failed, it was the first video game console to have online capabilities. But enough about the internet. We all know about the internet. You're on it right now. I really like the design of the Dreamcast. It's got a disc hatch instead of a disc drive, so it gets a plus for that. It was also probably the last console to have different designs based on what regions you're in. Although the only difference is the color of the swirl on the logo. In Europe it was blue, and here in North America and Japan we got this orange swirl. On top of the console design we got this thing. I mean, I don't want to focus too much on the controllers, but I mean, look at this thing, man. It's got one stick and a D-pad. Brilliant. Good job, Sega. Way to predict online connectivity for video games, but miss out on the whole 3D games require 2 analog sticks thing. The cord comes out of the bottom, and then it has this, like, clip thing that you stick the cable into. It's so weird, man. Like, I really don't get how the cable coming out of the bottom was that big a hindrance. If anything, I feel like this thing is a recipe for broken cables. By far the weirdest thing about the Dreamcast controller, though, is the VMU. The visual memory unit was a memory card that sticks into the controller, but it's not just any memory card. It has a little LCD screen and buttons on it so you can play games, I guess. Again, I don't have any games for this thing, so I don't really. The Xbox, baby. Microsoft's first foray into video games and arguably their last good foray into video games. Look at how fucking massive this thing is, man. I love it, but I also kind of hate it in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, you got these stupid creases on it which are a nightmare for dust, and it's got an optical disc tray, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it's fine. Fun thing about my Xbox is that the disc tray doesn't like to open very much. I guess that's the downside of buying a video game console for like $30 at Value Village. But thankfully, Microsoft clearly knew that this was a problem because they put this little hole in the front of the console as a fix. So all you gotta do is get a pin, stick it in there, and you gotta just kind of finagle. It takes a bit. You just gotta. Overall, I love the original Xbox. The cables for the controllers are super long and it may be ugly, but it's definitely got the most personality of all the Xbox consoles in my opinion. And finally, we have reached the big motherfucker of the 6th generation, Sony's PlayStation 2, and wow, this thing is very cool looking. It does have the same problem that the Xbox has with all these little creases, but it's such a cool console design. It's so early 2000s, but also so timeless. Plus, you can turn the PlayStation logo if you want to do that. The PS2 also had a design revision, the PS2 Slim, coming in at like half the size, and replacing the disc drive with a door, so it gets points for that. I feel like both of these are nice. You can't go wrong either way. My only real beef with the PS2 is that it started the whole trend of vertical video game consoles, which has remained a thing ever since. Like, fuck off. Why would I want my expensive electronic to be more likely to fall over and get damaged? Next up, we got the 7th generation of consoles, and by the grace of God, we only have 3 to look at, so let's get it poppin', baby. First off, we got the Nintendo Wii, Nintendo's baby bitch-ass console for casual snot-nosed kids. It's a white rectangle. What do you want from me? I would say that it's definitely the definitive vertical console. It had these little nubs on the side so degenerates like me could lay it on its side, but in general the quote-unquote correct way to display the Wii is vertically with this little base thing. I like the Wii, you know? I'm not hugely into glossy electronics because they collect dust, but the white kind of prevents the dust from being too visible. That said, the white color also makes it look really nasty over time. I'm not hugely into this little plastic door that protected the SD card slot. It's very flimsy. You're asking for this thing to break off. You know, like how mine is broken off, for example. The Wii also had a redesign, or should I say, a Wii design, called the Wii Mini, which was originally released exclusively in Canada. Hardware and specs aside, the Wii Mini is actually kind of neat looking. It's all matted, meaning no fingerprints or dust, and I kind of like the red on black look. I do think that the original Wii had a lot more personality to it, and it much better exemplifies what the Wii was. Like when I turn this on, I expect to see... This thing looks like it can only play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense to anyone? Next up is the Xbox 360, which came in 3 different designs. The original design is very nice in my opinion. It's got a nice matte finish and you can replace the faceplates, which no one ever did, but it's a neat feature nonetheless. This thing broke more frequently than it actually played video games, but aesthetically it's pretty cool looking. After everybody on the planet's Xbox stopped working and Microsoft got tired of telling people to fuck off and stop bothering them, they released a revised model called the Xbox 360S, and this is a very nice redesign. It has the same vibe as the original, but it's like sleeker and more modern looking. The hard drive is built right in and it just looks cooler. Vertically, horizontally, no matter how you look at this thing, it's neat. Right before the end of the 7th generation, Microsoft released yet another revision called the Xbox 360e and the PlayStation 3, Sony's massively overpriced and massively massive successor to the PS2. I, much like everyone else, hate the original PS3 model. It's enormous. The original PS3 logo straight up uses the font from the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. And worst of all, every inch of it is black and glossy, making it a magnet for fingerprints and dust. I seriously have to clean this thing like once a month at least because it gets caked in dust. It's unreal. Thankfully, Sony came to their senses and released the PS3 Slim, and this thing is much better looking. It's matted all over and has buttons instead of the original model's weird touch things, which greatly minimizes the likelihood that your cat will turn on your PS3 without your knowledge. It was also way cheaper, which was a huge deal. The original PS3 was the price and size of a house. After that, Sony released the PS3 Super Slim, which was kind of like a weird middle ground between the first two models. I've never seen one of these in real life, and I don't really know how I feel about it. It's got gloss on it, nice, fingerprint time, and I feel like these million little creases would collect a lot of dust. Plus, interestingly, the console slides open. This middle part slides across, and you put discs in there, which is so weird. I've never seen anything like that before. Moving swiftly along, we got the 8th generation, baby. It's starting out with the Wii U, and oh boy. Nintendo's disastrous attempt to follow up the Wii U fucking sucks. I'm sorry, it's ugly. It came in two models, the 8GB white console and the 32GB black model, which I have. And can I just start by saying gloss? Why? Once again, the whole fucking thing is shiny and glossy, meaning we've just entered the dust and fingerprint zone. The gamepad is comfortable, but I don't know, it's got this kind of cheap feel to it. The console itself, like, what do you want me to say? It's a rectangle. A very long rectangle, too. The weird thing about the Wii U is that it felt like the marketing was trying to hide how long the console was. As a result, when I took it out of the box, I was like, holy shit. Because the Wii U is a massive failure, Nintendo released their next console, toot sweet, the Nintendo Switch, and now we're talking, baby. This is what the Wii U should have been. The Switch may be underpowered, but goddamn is it ever cool looking. The dock is so small and unassuming, and it just looks cool sitting on a shelf, especially with the Joy-Cons sticking out of the sides. And then in handheld mode, it's simple, but very cool and sleek looking. Nintendo also released a budget handheld-only revision of the Switch called the Switch Lite, and I don't know about this one. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but it's just kind of bland and cheap looking. It's like it's missing something. Like the console is all one color and the buttons are all white. I feel like they should have added more color to it or something to make it a little bit more visually appealing. Next up is the brilliantly named Xbox One, and you know, people have a good laugh at the name of the console, but hey, at the very least, I think it perfectly exemplifies how little of a shit Microsoft gave this time around. The Xbone comes in 3 different flavors, the original model being this. Unfortunately, I don't have one of these, but I have seen one and it is fucking gigantic. I don't hate the design of this thing as much as a lot of people do, but that certainly doesn't mean that I care about it. Thankfully, they redesigned the Xbox One, calling this one the Xbox One S, and this is a very cool looking video game console. It's very sleek, it's all matted. I imagine that these little holes must be somewhat of a nightmare for dust, but it still looks cool. And finally, you have the even more brilliantly named Xbox One X, not to be mistaken with the Xbox One S or the Xbox Series X or the Xbox Series S, all of which are completely different video game consoles. I'm gonna walk into traffic real quick. This is the definitive Xbox One. It's black, sleek, modern, it's just cool looking. One thing I feel the need to mention, however, is how fucking heavy this thing is. I know you obviously can't tell you through your computer screen, but this is probably the heaviest video game console I've ever seen in my life. Next up is the Sony PlayStation 4, and I know that on paper I should hate this console design. The big sliver is asking for dust, and it has a big-ass glossy panel. But I think this is the best console design Sony has ever done. It just looks so cool, the big light that goes across it, it's simple, but it's so nice. The redesigns, on the other hand, the PS4 Pro is just fucking stupid, like another layer. That's how you know it's better. And the Slim is fine. It's not as cool as the original though. That said, if you're gonna get a PS4, you probably want to go for the Pro, because my original PS4 model sounds like a fucking jet engine trying to run any game that came out past 2016. And ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to say that we have finally reached present day in the 9th generation of video game consoles. Now, when the Xbox One X came out, everyone said there's no way Microsoft could pick a dumber name this time around. So here's the Xbox Series X and the Xbox Series S. What the fuck are these? The Series X is just like a big rectangle, and the Series S looks exactly like the Xbox One S with a black circle, as if this all wasn't already confusing enough. I gotta say, I'm really disappointed that they didn't go with the design for the Series S that was floating around the internet. God forbid Microsoft release a GameCube in 2020. In summary, the Xbox Series X is revealed. Everyone laughed. Sony said, "Oh, you want to see a bad console design?" And everyone said, "No." So Sony went, What the f? What is this thing? It looks like a fucking spaceship. It is bar none, without a doubt, in my opinion, the worst console design Sony has ever made. And yes, I'm including the original PS3. Plus, look at the fucking size of this thing. As far as I know, it's actually officially the biggest video game console of all time. I'm sorry, but I hate the design of this console. And as if it wasn't bad enough, it doesn't even sit flat on a table. You have to sit this dumbass stand underneath it so that it doesn't wobble back and forth. Like, man, I love my PS5, but I'm gonna be pissed when they release a redesign that looks a million times better in a couple years. Holy smokes, that was a lot of computer game machines. That took a lot longer than expected. Why are there so many video game consoles? Now I know what you're all thinking. Oh, Ben, why didn't you talk about the handhelds? I don't know.